In this inaugural episode of the Atari Archive, we begin our chronological journey through the Atari 2600 library with Combat, also known as Tank Plus to you Sears shoppers. The 1970s were a time of rapid growth and change in the nascent video game industry. Over the course of the decade, arcade video games were commercially introduced, grew in complexity, and shifted from black and white to color. But video games as we know them started in the home, and there was a great deal of interest in bringing those arcade experiences back to the rumpus room. Early home consoles were dedicated machines capable of only playing whatever the circuitry had built in. No programming was involved, just well-designed hardware. Although Magnavox's Odyssey system functionally was the home market for the first few years, by the mid-1970s, the market was flooded with these dedicated consoles, and electronics giants like Fairchild and RCA were in a race, with arcade game developers such as Atari and Bally to change that paradigm and hit the storefronts with consoles capable of interchangeable new games. Atari's effort, the video computer system, had its first proof-of-concept prototype design completed on paper in 1975 by engineers Steve Mayer and Ron Milner. And already the idea of porting Atari's subsidiary Key Games' Tank arcade machine was in the front of the engineers' minds. The design included the idea of running what would become Combat on the eventual system, and the initial prototype used the arcade machine's dual-stick control setup to run a basic version of Tank as a proof of concept. A second pair of hardware designers named Jay Miner and Joe DeCure were charged with building out that prototype design and turning it into a commercial product, with one basic edict: that the VCS should be able to run home versions of Tank and Pong. In a presentation at the Portland Gaming Expo, as well as in interviews, DeCure explained that VCS was built with the practical limitations of what technology was available in 1975 and 76 that was also cost-effective for a consumer product. Their final design featured a stripped-down 6502 CPU, 128 bytes of RAM, and a custom graphics chip called Stella. Some of the design compromises ended up being strengths. Notably, the system lacked the ability to build a display all at once as a frame buffer, as Fairchild's Channel F and RCA's Studio 2 did. This left programmers to use precious CPU cycles to time out the screen line by line, before calculating inputs, collisions, and other actions during the overscan period, effectively racing the television's electron beam down the screen and back around from the top. This challenging quirk ended up being key to the system's longevity, with programmers firmly in control of the screen display line by line. Tricks like Starfields, Sunsets, and the Venetian blinds kept the system looking and playing better than its contemporaries into the early 1980s. It also allowed the display to move much more smoothly than its early competitors before the affordable technology was there to improve frame buffer displays. But in 1976 and 77, DeCure was still designing the system alongside Tank. Calling himself little more than an implementer based on Mayer and Milner's concepts, he got the basic display engine running for Tank on the VCS before passing the project along to Larry Wagner, Atari's head of game development. Wagner added in multiple variations, a selling point that became a standard for VCS games in its early years. The Tank game featured variations from invisible tanks and more complex mazes to ricocheting shots in Tank Pong, and a billiards mode where players could only score a point after a ricochet shot. Wagner even included a port of Atari's Jet Fighter arcade game, which had been released in 1975. Jet Fighter, in turn, had its own variations, adding in obscuring clouds or replacing the aircraft with biplanes. No input on the game console was wasted. The difficulty switches were used to determine how far shots would go, essentially allowing a better player to handicap themselves against a weaker one. After approximately 2 minutes and 16 seconds, a contest between two players would end, and the game would return to its color cycling attract mode. The select switch cycled through the different game types, while reset started the selected game, a much simpler arrangement to get a game going than the Channel F or Studio 2's Byzantine sequences of button presses. And cognizant of that most people still had black and white televisions in their homes in 1977, Atari made sure the color switch on the console would flip the game to a black and white TV friendly mode, where all the colors became grayscale. The finished product, released as Combat, ended up as the pack-in title with the VCS when it hit retail. The system's early competitors had built-in games, a reasonable move since the home market was predominantly dedicated consoles. Though this had been considered for the VCS during development, Atari ultimately decided to pack in a cartridge containing a pair of its arcade titles. This made the system's design abundantly clear. This was a machine built around modular games, completely unlike the vast majority of systems already on the market. That Atari included a cartridge also suggests that they were aware that people expected to be able to play their new game system out of the box. Of course, since no one was keeping track of release dates at that point in time, the only clues to when the VCS and Combat launched were based on early advertisements, which started running regionally in August and September from retailers like Long's Drug Stores, Sears, Macy's, and Payless Super Drug Stores. Combat was also sold separately, as the giant retailer Sears packed in a different game with their Telegames branded version of the VCS. The system and Combat immediately existed as technological steps above the Fairchild Channel F in the RCA Studio 2, with smooth action, greater color depth, and more natural sound effects. The Channel F's own tank clone, Desert Fox, may have included the arcade version's landmines, but had jerkier movements and lacked the gameplay options and refinements that Combat brought to the fore. Even the game's lack of a single-player option played to Atari's strengths. At the time of the VCS's launch, the vast majority of home games were multiplayer. This made sense, given that cartridge games were working with limited space while programmers continued to figure out these new platforms. But beyond being a routine design decision in the 1970s, it also meant that new people would have to be introduced to these games so that the owner, or their family members, would have someone else to play the games with. According to Decure, Atari sold in excess of 250,000 units in the first year, and it seems likely that word of mouth played a role in that early success. Combat ended up becoming synonymous with the Atari VCS, sticking around as a pack-in until 1982, and continuing to be sold separately. Even today, virtually everyone who owns the VCS has at least one copy sitting around somewhere, and unsurprisingly, the successive owners of the Atari catalog have continued to make it available, either on dedicated Atari flashback consoles or included in game collections on modern platforms. Atari even announced a sequel, Combat 2, in 1982, but the game went unfinished and commercially unreleased until the prototype was included in 2005's Atari Flashback 2 console. Combat may not feature some of the fancy visual effects or gameplay complexities of later VCS titles, but it continues to stand as one of the system's finest multiplayer experiences. Not bad for the first game ever designed for the platform. Next time, the VCS's alternative pack-in, Air-Sea Battle.